It was supposed to be a peaceful meeting, a misunderstanding, maybe even just a bad translation. But in the dry heat of Arizona in 1861, one single mistake, a small decision made by a young U.S. officer, would set off a chain reaction of violence, revenge, and war. A prisoner taken, a promise broken, and suddenly the desert was burning. This is the story of the cut that started a war, and the fierce Apache uprising that followed. In the early 1860s, tensions in the American Southwest were already high. White settlers, Mexican ranchers, and native tribes were all trying to survive in a region filled with hunger, drought, and distrust. The U.S. Army was stretched thin, trying to keep the peace across a wild and dangerous frontier. Among the tribes that called the desert home were the Chiricahua Apache, fierce, proud, and deeply protective of their land. They had watched as settlers moved closer and closer. For years, small skirmishes broke out. Raids, stolen horses, attacks blamed on the Apaches. But nothing had sparked a full-scale war. That changed in February 1861. A rancher's young son was taken from his farm near Sonoita, Arizona. His name was Felix Ward. His family claimed the Apaches had kidnapped him during a raid. In truth, no one really knew who had taken him. It might have been another tribe entirely. But emotions ran high, and the pressure to act fell on a young lieutenant named George Bascom. Bascom was just 26 years old. Eager to prove himself and unfamiliar with the Apache ways, he made a bold decision. He invited the Apache leader Cochise to meet him at the Apache Pass to discuss the boy's disappearance. Cochise, respected among his people and known for keeping his word, agreed to the meeting. Cochise came with a small group, his wife, a few warriors, and some family. He expected to talk. What he didn't expect was a trap. Bascom accused Cochise of kidnapping the boy. When Cochise denied it, Bascom tried to detain him and his people, but Cochise escaped, cutting his way out of a tent and fleeing into the desert. His family members weren't so lucky. Bascom kept them as prisoners. What happened next would shake the Southwest to its core. Cochise was furious. In his culture, a meeting under a white flag meant safety. It meant trust. Bascom had violated that. And to make it worse, Cochise's family, his brother, nephews, even his wife, were now captives of the U.S. Army. It was a deep insult, a wound that could only be healed with blood. Cochise responded the only way he knew how, with fire and force. Within days, Apache warriors began launching raids across the region. They attacked supply lines, ambushed soldiers, and burned ranches. Travelers were killed on roads, communication lines were cut. The desert, once quiet, became a place of fear. At Apache Pass, Cochise made a daring move. He took hostages, white settlers, soldiers, even a stagecoach crew. He hoped to exchange them for his family, but Bascom refused. He believed giving in would show weakness. Instead of negotiating, he dug in, preparing for a long fight. When the swap failed, Cochise executed the hostages. In response, Bascom hanged Cochise's family members. It was now personal. A cycle of revenge had begun, and there was no turning back. What had started as a misunderstanding had now become war. For the next decade, the Apache would wage a brutal guerrilla war against the U.S. military. They knew the land better than anyone. They moved through the mountains like shadows. They attacked without warning and vanished before soldiers could fire a shot. Cochise led with skill and rage. He knew he couldn't defeat the army in open battle, but he didn't need to. His goal was to make Arizona ungovernable, to strike fear, to make settlers and soldiers question whether it was worth staying. He was joined by another powerful Apache leader, Mangus Coloradus, Cochise's father-in-law. Together, they turned the desert into a war zone. Towns were abandoned, trade routes were avoided, forts were under constant threat. The army, confused and outmaneuvered, struck back hard. They launched massive campaigns into Apache territory. They built new forts. They offered rewards for Apache scalps. But for every Apache killed, more rose in their place. The land itself seemed to fight back. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, made things even worse. With Union troops pulled back east, Arizona was left exposed. The Confederate Army briefly tried to take control of the territory, but chaos reigned. Apache raids increased. No one was safe. By the mid-1860s, the war had taken its toll. Thousands had died. Trust was gone. What could have been solved with diplomacy had spiraled into a nightmare. And it had all started with one mistake. By the early 1870s, Cochise was growing tired. Decades of war had aged him. His people were suffering, hunted, starving, tired of running. He wanted peace, but he also wanted dignity. A new U.S. commander, General Oliver O. Howard, was sent to Arizona with a different plan. He didn't want more battles. He wanted to talk. He brought a civilian negotiator named Tom Jeffords, one of the few white men Cochise trusted. Jeffords reached out to Cochise. Slowly, carefully, a dialogue began. The war chief agreed to meet, and this time, unlike with Bascom, the white flag meant something. In 1872, Cochise agreed to a peace treaty. In return, he and his people would be allowed to live on a reservation in their homeland, the Chiricahua Mountains. It wasn't perfect, but it was peace. 1 year later, Cochise died of natural causes. He was buried in a secret location known only to his people. The war didn't end completely. Other Apache leaders like Geronimo would continue the fight for years. But the uprising that had begun in 1861, the one sparked by the cut of a tent and the breaking of a truce, had reached its end. Cochise's decision to escape that tent was not just a desperate act of survival, it was a message. He had come in peace and had been met with betrayal. The knife that sliced through the canvas also severed any lingering trust between his people and the U.S. military. That single cut started a chain reaction of misunderstanding, violence, and retaliation that reshaped the American Southwest for decades. But the consequences didn't stop there. When Cochise agreed to the peace treaty in 1872, it came with an important condition: that Tom Jeffords, the man who had treated him with respect and listened to his people, be appointed as the Indian agent for the Chiricahua Reservation. Against the advice of many in Washington, General Howard agreed. And for a time, things worked. Cochise kept the peace. His warriors stayed in their territory. Jeffords ensured that rations and supplies reached the people. For the first time in years, the killings stopped. But the peace built on personalities is fragile. When Cochise died in 1874, everything changed. The government removed Jeffords. The army resumed its hardline approach. Settlers pushed for more land. Politicians called for tighter control over unruly tribes. Soon, the Chiricahua Reservation was dissolved. Apache families were relocated far from their ancestral lands, told to abandon the mountains they had lived in for centuries. And from the ashes of Cochise's peace rose another fighter, Geronimo. Though from a different Apache band, Geronimo had lived through the same betrayals. His family had been killed by Mexican soldiers. He had fought beside Cochise, and when the U.S. tried to force the Apache onto distant reservations, Geronimo rebelled. For years, he led raids, escaped capture, and became the face of Apache resistance. The war Cochise tried to end quietly roared back to life. The U.S. military deployed thousands of soldiers. Scouts were hired. Forts were reinforced. Entire towns lived in fear of Apache raids. And yet, Geronimo always seemed one step ahead, vanishing into the mountains, reappearing miles away, striking without warning. Eventually, even Geronimo would surrender. In 1886, surrounded and exhausted, he laid down his arms. But by then, the Apache had been scattered. Many were sent to Florida, far from their homeland. Some never saw the desert again. It's easy to look back now and wonder, what if? What if Bascom had believed Cochise? What if he'd waited, asked more questions, or sought more evidence before making his arrest? What if that boy, Felix Ward, had never been taken, or had been returned sooner? Ironically, he was later found living with another tribe, having been adopted and renamed Mickey Free. He would eventually become a scout for the U.S. Army, fighting against the very people he'd once lived among. What if the Army had sent someone older, wiser, and more experienced than Bascom to the first meeting? Someone who knew the Apaches were fiercely loyal to their families and wouldn't tolerate betrayal. Someone who understood that taking Cochise's relatives was more than a tactical move. It was a declaration of war. Decades later, historians would revisit the Bascom affair, as it came to be known, and see it for what it was: a tragedy of misunderstanding, a diplomatic failure, a reminder of what happens when power overrides wisdom. The Apache, once feared and hunted, now live on in smaller numbers. Many descendants remain proud of their heritage, passing down stories, songs, and traditions. But the wounds of the past haven't fully healed. How could they? Their leaders were betrayed. Their lands were taken. Their names were turned into myths and movie villains. But they remember. They remember the cut that started a war. Not just a physical wound, but a symbolic one. Because in the end, the Apache uprising wasn't about a missing boy, or even about Cochise's escape. It was about respect, about dignity, about the line between survival and surrender. And in that moment, in that tent, the line was crossed. History often hides the small moments, the quiet decisions, the overlooked gestures that spark great change. We tend to remember the big events, the battles, the treaties, but sometimes it's the smallest spark that sets the world on fire. The Apache uprising began not with a declaration, but with a cut. One blade, one act of defiance, and from that moment came decades of war, resistance, and heartbreak. History isn't just about what happened, it's about what it cost.